There is a moment in every major conflict when the story stops being about missiles and starts being about something far more dangerous: words. And right now, the most powerful man on earth and the government of one of the most strategically located countries in the world are telling two completely different stories about the same conversation. Donald Trump stood in front of cameras today and said the United States and Iran have had, in his own words, very good and productive conversations. He posted it in all caps on Truth Social. He told CNBC he is very intent on making a deal. He said there are major points of agreement. He said Iran called him first. He said his son-in-law Jared Kushner and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff sat down with a top Iranian official just last Sunday night. He described 15 specific points of agreement, including Iran accepting that it will never have nuclear weapons. And then he said something extraordinary. He said the U.S. military has been instructed to postpone all strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for 5 days while these talks continue. 5 days. A pause. A window. And Trump said if the deal goes through, the Strait of Hormuz opens very soon and peace comes to the region. That was his version of events this morning. Now here is Iran's version. Iranian state media, citing a senior security official, posted on Telegram that direct or indirect talks have not taken place between Washington and Tehran. Iran's semi-official Mehr news agency flatly denied that any dialogue occurred, not a dispute about the details of the conversation. A denial that the conversation happened at all. Two sides. One moment. Two completely opposite accounts. And sitting in the middle of that contradiction is a world that desperately needs to know which version is true, because the answer changes everything. The answer changes whether oil prices keep climbing or start falling. The answer changes whether American troops in the region are moving toward a ceasefire or toward another wave of strikes. The answer changes whether the Strait of Hormuz, which carries a fifth of the world's oil supply, opens in 5 days or stays locked in the most dangerous standoff we have seen in decades. Welcome to Unlocked History Hub, and if you want to stay ahead of every development as this story moves, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe right now so you never miss a breakdown like this one. Before we go deeper into what is really happening between Washington and Tehran, take 2 seconds and join our WhatsApp channel. The link is in the description below. That is where we share the fastest updates and breaking developments the moment they happen, so you are never behind on a story this important. Let me give you the full picture, because this contradiction between Trump and Iran did not appear out of nowhere. It has a specific history, and that history tells you a lot about why both versions of this story can exist at the same time and why neither side is necessarily lying in the way you might think. When the U.S. and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, it was not a surprise attack in the traditional sense. There had been months of negotiations, talks in Oman, talks in Rome, talks in Muscat. Iran and the U.S. had actually sat across from each other through mediators 3 times before the bombs started falling, and then something broke down. The strikes happened. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed. A new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, was installed in what Iranian state institutions described as a continuity transition. And the war that everyone had been trying to prevent became the war everyone was now trying to survive. That context matters because what you are watching today is not simply Trump making things up. It is almost certainly a reflection of the genuinely murky nature of back-channel diplomacy during an active war. When Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff sit down with, as Trump described it, a top-respected Iranian person, that meeting may have happened through a layer of intermediaries that Iran's official government can honestly deny knowledge of. Oman has been the traditional mediating channel between Washington and Tehran for years. A conversation brokered through Omani officials might technically be described by Iran's foreign ministry as not a direct negotiation, because it was not a direct negotiation. Both statements can be simultaneously true and simultaneously misleading. That is how diplomacy works when nobody is ready to publicly commit to anything. But here is where it gets genuinely significant and where my honest read of this situation differs from the most optimistic headlines. Trump did not just describe a vague diplomatic outreach. He described 15 specific points of agreement. He said Iran has agreed it will never have nuclear weapons. He said the Strait of Hormuz will open very soon if a deal is reached. He said his envoys met with a top Iranian official as recently as Sunday night. That level of specificity is either an accurate description of very real progress, or it is a deliberate strategic narrative designed to create public pressure on Iran to either confirm the talks and legitimize them or deny them and look like they are refusing peace. Both possibilities are worth taking seriously, because Trump has used public statements to create negotiating pressure before. In this very conflict, the 48-hour ultimatum threatening to obliterate Iranian power plants was a public statement designed to create maximum pressure. The pause on those strikes, announced just this morning, is also a public statement. Everything Trump is saying right now is part of a negotiating environment where information itself is a weapon. What I find most telling is the detail about Jared Kushner's involvement. Kushner is not a military advisor. He is not a traditional diplomat. He is the person Trump used to broker the Abraham Accords in the first term. His presence in these talks, if they are real, signals that Trump genuinely wants a deal structured around a historic agreement rather than a military conclusion. The Abraham Accords were about regional normalization. A U.S.-Iran deal that ends this war and includes nuclear limits would be in a completely different category. It would be the biggest diplomatic achievement any American president has claimed in a generation. And Trump knows that. The political incentive for Trump to make this deal happen is enormous. High oil prices heading into midterm elections are a serious political problem. An inflation spike driven by energy costs is a serious political problem. A prolonged military campaign without a clear endgame is a serious political problem. A deal, on the other hand, would be a historic claim. Trump said it himself today. He said this will be peace for Israel. He said Iran can rejoin the global economy. He was describing a Nobel Prize moment, and he knows what that moment would mean politically. Now let me tell you what this war has already cost the world, because the deal talk, as hopeful as it sounds, cannot erase the damage that has already happened and is still accumulating. The International Monetary Fund, before any of this week's developments, had already warned that the Iran-Israel conflict represents the single greatest risk to the 2026 global economic outlook. Oil prices had crossed $115 a barrel and were still climbing. The global shipping industry had been rerouting tankers away from the Strait of Hormuz at enormous added cost, taking routes around the Cape of Good Hope that add weeks to delivery times and hundreds of thousands of dollars per voyage. Shipping insurance costs for Gulf transits had gone up by factors of 10 or more. Qatar suspended LNG production after drone attacks on March 2nd. Global liquefied natural gas prices surged nearly 60%. Airlines across Asia, Europe, and the Americas raised ticket prices citing fuel costs. In Germany, diesel prices jumped by double digits in a single week. Bangladesh declared a near-fuel emergency with government rationing. Pakistan announced emergency austerity and a 4-day work week for government employees. The Philippines saw its currency hit record lows against the dollar. These are not distant statistics. These are the downstream effects of a conflict that began in one narrow waterway and have now washed up on the shores of economies that had nothing to do with starting it. For American households specifically, the arithmetic is straightforward and painful. Gas prices crossed $3.94 a gallon on the national average before today's deal news caused markets to pull back. Goldman Sachs warned that sustained elevated oil prices could push U.S. consumer inflation from 2.4% back toward 3% or higher. Former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen described the conflict as putting the Federal Reserve even more on hold regarding rate cuts, and rate cuts matter to every American carrying a mortgage, a car loan, or credit card debt. Every month the Fed stays on hold is another month of higher borrowing costs for tens of millions of people. The Federal Reserve had been expected to cut rates twice in 2026 before this conflict began. Those expectations have now been pushed back significantly. That is real money. That is real financial pressure. And it comes from events happening in a part of the world most Americans were not focused on 6 months ago. There is also a military dimension to the pause that deserves serious attention. Trump ordered the suspension of strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for 5 days. That is a significant restraint signal. Earlier this week, Iran's parliament had voted to give its military authorization to completely close the Strait of Hormuz if Iranian power plants were struck. That was the specific red line that the 48-hour ultimatum was designed to push up against. By pausing the power plant strikes, Trump stepped back from that specific red line without stepping back from the broader conflict. It is a calibrated move, not a retreat, a pause. And it gives both sides a 5-day window to either move toward the deal Trump is describing or return to full military operations. The next 5 days are genuinely consequential in a way that few diplomatic windows in recent history have been. Looking at everything available right now, here is what I think is actually happening. Real conversations are taking place at some level, almost certainly through intermediaries like Oman, and those conversations have produced enough substance that Trump feels confident describing specific points of agreement. Iran's official denial is consistent with its domestic political constraints. Publicly confirming negotiations with the country currently bombing you is domestically toxic for any Iranian government. The denial is the required public position, even if the conversations are real. The 5-day pause is designed to test whether Iran will demonstrate good faith through actions rather than statements. If the Strait of Hormuz sees more commercial traffic in the next 48 to 72 hours, that will be a stronger signal than any press statement, and the world will be watching that waterway very carefully. What concerns me about the optimistic read is the gap between Trump's description of 15 points of agreement and Iran's flat denial. 15 points is specific. It is not vague diplomatic language. If those 15 points are real, someone on the Iranian side committed to something substantial, and Iran's official denial means those commitments were made without full government authorization. That is a genuinely unstable diplomatic position because commitments made without authorization can be reversed without notice. The world needs this deal. The economic evidence for that is overwhelming. The humanitarian evidence for that is overwhelming. The political logic on both sides points towards some kind of negotiated outcome. But wanting a deal and having a deal are two different things. And the gap between Trump's version of today's events and Iran's version of today's events is exactly the size of that difference. This story is moving fast, and every development in the next 5 days matters enormously for oil prices, global markets, regional stability, and the daily costs that ordinary Americans are absorbing from a war they did not choose. We are going to track every single development on this channel, so you are never left trying to piece it together from confusing headlines. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Trump's deal claim is real, or is this a pressure tactic? Do you think Iran comes to the table publicly before the 5 days run out? Your perspective matters on this question, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Share this video with someone who is trying to understand what is happening and why it matters to their wallet and their daily life. This is Unlocked History Hub. Stay sharp, stay informed, and we will see you in the next breakdown.